Welcome to the Healthy Heart Show, where we pull back the curtain on conventional medicine and dive into the root causes of cardiovascular health. If you are concerned about high cholesterol, high blood pressure, heart attacks, stroke, or atrial fibrillation, this is the place for you. We will provide natural heart information that will help you prevent, treat, and reverse any ailment, leaving pills and procedures out of the picture. Here are your guides to holistic heart health, board-certified cardiologist and Amazon best-selling author, Dr. Jack Wolfson, and natural heart doctor, naturopathic physician, Dr. Lauren Lattanza.
Hello, fellow cardiac longevists. Welcome to the Healthy Heart Show, where we discuss how to live your best heart-healthy life without pharmaceuticals and surgeries. I'm board-certified Dr. Jack Wolfson, and our goal here is to support your 100-year heart. We're going to be talking about a lot of things in this episode today. Very, very exciting. But always keep in mind, everything we're talking about, how it pertains to heart health, how it pertains to atrial fibrillation, congestive heart failure, coronary artery disease, heart attack, strokes, everything heart related. There's a purpose to all of these episodes, and it always goes back to the heart. Now, as we help the heart, we help everything else in the body as well. You know that. So I want to introduce Dr. Lauren Lattanza. Dr. Lauren Lattanza is our naturopathic medical doctor here at Natural Heart Doctor. Dr. Lauren, how are you?
I'm doing well. I'm happy to be here. Thank you for the introduction.
Excellent. Great to have you on. And today our special guest is Michael Schrantz. And Michael Schrantz, if you don't know him, you need to know him because he is an absolute worldwide expert that so many people go to when it comes to indoor air quality, when it comes to living in a healthy home or a healthy office. And we call him sometimes, I think sometimes people have referred to him as Dr. House. Dr. Lattanza and I are natural heart doctors. And then now we've got Dr. House, if you remember that TV show. And this is the House Doctor, Michael Schrantz. Mike is with Environmental Analytics. You can check out his website. We'll put that in the show notes as well. Environmentalanalytics.net is the website. It's an environmental consulting firm. It's been in business all the way back since 2007. And obviously sees a lot of people locally in the Southwest. He's based out of Tucson, Arizona. But again, he does a lot of consulting work. And maybe at the end, Michael, we'll give you an opportunity to tell people how to get in touch with you as well. So, Michael, welcome to the Healthy Heart Show.
Dr. Wolfson, Dr. Lattanza, thank you so much. This is a great opportunity. Looking forward to it.
Great. So let me, we'll jump right into it. I'll let Dr. Lattanza kind of fire away with some of her questions because I know she's been very anxious to ask you all these things. And really where we see this episode going, is essentially kind of, once someone either thinks they've been exposed to mold or they've got mold mycotoxins that are in their urine. So it shows that mold mycotoxins, these things that are released from the mold, they're coming into the body, they're being excreted out of their urine. Now, what do we do from where's this mold exposure coming from? Dr. Lauren, what do you think?
Yeah, so you and I have the job of finding the root cause. We kind of ask the questions and identify if our patients are potentially having mold exposure. And we kind of see the light bulb go off in patients' heads frequently. And you know what? We did have some water damage X amount of years back, and we didn't really have it fully taken care of. Or, under my sink, I see this, that, and the other. So what are the next steps once we identify that and once we identify it through the urine testing? So, Michael, what do you find the percentage of homes suffer from water damage?
You see these numbers getting pushed around all the time, and whether we want to reference things of like out of the World Health Organization reports or other things, kind of a safe number to probably say is 50-50. 50% of the homes, of course, it's bias, right? Coming from my end, because people that don't necessarily have problems aren't going out of their way to talk to me. It's normally people that have issues. But I'll tell you, just from common sense and just the nature of how homes are designed and how difficult, challenging weather can be, probably stands to reason that a vast majority of homes have had at least some experience at one time with either some sort of a minor leak. Think toilet overflow. How easy can that happen? A plumbing leak, a roof leak, and certainly there's more dramatic climatic issues, floods, that sort of thing, it's a significant issue. Whether the number is 50% or 90%, that's enough to get our attention.
Absolutely. Yeah. And where would you see most of that damage occurring, you find?
Tricky to say. Great question, because, as an IEP, an indoor environmental professional, for those of you who might not be familiar, when we go out into the environment, we do try to look at low-hanging fruit issues. It's kind of similar to your intake of how you look at it with a patient first. It's tell us the history, tell us what you know. I mean, it's a village. It takes a team effort to understand things. So a lot of times they'll say, well, we had a leak 5 years ago. Maybe we never knew that because they painted over the evidence. But the low-hanging fruit issues, a lot of times, if they have a crawl space, I never seem to have a lot of good luck with crawl spaces because they don't have to have standing water for someone to think that there might be a microbial issue going on there, and then maybe communicating into the living spaces above. Or in more humid climates, I think of Miami, Florida as an easy, cheap example here, where just having high levels of moisture in the air and not regulating that house. This is the common story of the client that calls you guys up and say, it's weird, I have mold growing on some of my furniture and my books, and it's not related to a plumbing leak or a window leak. It's that sort of thing. So really depends on the climate we're talking about. Arizona might look a little bit different than, say, for example, Miami, Florida. It all needs to be screened at the end of the day, because that's how things are typically missed, is when we say, we don't have to worry about the attic. We don't have to worry about the crawl space, that sort of thing.
Right.
Yeah, those are certainly great points. You're becoming like that inspector of water damaged building. And clearly, I think people who live in humid climates, like you mentioned, the Southeast, stereotypical, I would have to think that the water damage from those houses does approach close to 100%, unless it's brand new. And even if it's totally brand new, mold takes a very short time to take hold whenever there is water exposure. But even those in the Southwest, right? The Arizonas, the California desert, the Utah, the Colorado, where we live, where these are typically dry climates. But again, as I tell people, if you have running water, you can have mold. But you bring up a good point, and I think maybe we can address, how does somebody remediate what you said if they live in a more humid climate? What do you do about generalized humidity?
Yeah, right. Moisture control is the one thing we have control on. When we think about fungal growth, bacterial growth, loosely microbial growth, we think that, we can't really control the viable spores or cells that are floating around. They're a normal part of our ecosystem. Ironically, we wouldn't be here without them. They serve an actual good purpose here. Of course, that's not what we're talking about. And nutrients are plentiful as well. They're everywhere. They're abundant. There's people listening right now said, I've seen mold grow on glass. Well, it's not eating the glass, right? It's eating the nutrients that are on the glass. The one thing we can do, though, when we can do it, is control the moisture. So to answer the question, in the more humid climates, moisture control is key. And you've heard things like whole house dehumidifiers, portable dehumidifiers. Yes, there's a misconception for those who use air conditioning systems. And my background actually originates in air conditioning here in Arizona. And a lot of folks think that their evaporator coil, the part that gives you the cooling, for those of you who have it, is a dehumidifier. And that would be incorrect. It does help manage and maintain some moisture levels in the house, but by and large, its primary purpose is not that. So that means that the occupant living in that hot, humid climate is going to be looking at portable dehumidification or whole house dehumidification, which leads to the follow-up question often asked is, well, what's a good level, a range? And you see it all over the map. When we talk about health, you'll typically see in the summertime that there's a range of 40 to 60%. What we like to say is let's keep it around 35 to 40% and understand 35 to 50%. And let me explain why. Because we want buffer. We want some wiggle room. Because we know that, first of all, not every hygrometer or device that measures moisture in the air is going to be accurate down to the 0.1% or whatever, and there's going to be wiggle room. And we also understand that while moisture, typically if it's 50% in one room, it might be fairly close to that in another room. It's not exact. And so if you have it at that 35 to 50% target range, you're going to have enough wiggle room to where if it's a little bit higher in another room, no big deal. And of course, I'm not talking about a rain like we just had a monsoon storm here in Arizona, in Tucson. And that's a short little spike of moisture. I'm not worried about that. I'm talking about you folks that are dealing with sustained levels of high moisture for weeks and months. And if you have it in that range, again, it gives you that buffer, but yet it's also high enough. Remember, I said 35% on the other end of the range to avoid some of those more respiratory concerns that probably from your perspective that you're also considering when you're thinking about exposure and health and that sort of thing.
No, that's some fantastic points that you make in there. And again, what we're talking about today with Michael Schrantz, the indoor environmental professional, an expert at environmental analytics. So you can check out his website, environmentalanalytics.net. What we're talking about is, people who have symptoms related to water damaged buildings, and those symptoms, really any symptom you may be suffering from, it could be from water damaged building and mold mycotoxins, for example. Whatever disease you've been labeled with, heart disease, cancer, dementia, autoimmune, blood pressure, cholesterol, whatever anxiety, stress, depression, brain fog, all these different things, whatever you're labeled with, we want you to consider that it could be from water damaged building, poor indoor air quality, and these mold mycotoxins. And then we test so many people's urine and we're finding these mycotoxins that are in there. And now it's up to people like Michael Schrantz to find out where these are coming from. So Dr. Lauren, what do you think? So now you test someone's mycotoxins and they're high in their urine. What do you want them to do with Michael?
Right. So that's kind of the next question is, okay, so it's identified, and then what do I do now? Well, you have to identify where it's coming from. So that's, again, we're living in the Southwest. It's a dry climate. So people think that we're safe here. We bone dry outside, other than today, about probably 350 right. days of the year. So we think we're safe. So then, how do we find somebody like you? Maybe they're not in Arizona. So how would somebody find an indoor air environmental professional to get out to their home?
Yeah, two-part answer here. The first part real quick is a couple of resources out there. There's different organizations that have lists of professionals that you think of it as a get your foot in the door type of thing, a minimum amount. And one such organization is called the American Council for Accredited Certification. I know it's a mouthful. Here's the good news. Their website's a lot easier. The letters ACAC.org. ACAC.org. And if you go onto their website, I'm actually peeking out on my end, you see there's a tab that says find certificates, and you kind of follow the narrative, put in your zip code, and it'll pull up a list of potential professionals for you to find. So there's one way. The other way is there's another organization called the International Society for Environmentally Acquired Illness. Oh no, another long name, but here's the good news. Their website is easier. The letters ISEAI.org. Again, they have a Get Help tab, and there's professionals. That one's actually a little bit more vetted, if you will, for people who have a better understanding, IEPs of chronic illness, low dose environmental exposure concerns where your traditional inspector might miss it. That's the quick two go-tos that I can offer here without going much deeper. However, the big challenge at the end of the day is, does that mean that if they have that IEP, a lot of times what people run into is, I had an inspector come out, they did a couple spore trap samples, they didn't find anything, said my house was fine, but my doctor is saying there is an exposure issue. Sound familiar to you guys? And so there needs to be a lot of education. I only plug IEP Radio, which is a podcast of mine right now, because there's a lot of episodes in there that the audience can go to and learn for free to get a better idea of what you should expect from that IEP when they go out to your house. Because at the end of the day, whether you want to hear this or not, here's some real truth. You're going to have to be your own ambassador. You're not going to be able to teleport me out to your house the day of the visit of that IEP to vet that individual. So I want to give you that free information. Check it out. IEPradio.com is a great resource for you to further vet that professional you're looking for to come out to your home or your office and try and find out where that contamination may be.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing those resources.
Yeah.
So
we'll put all those in the notes as well. And what I tell Michael is that I tell my patients, is that, okay, you paid a lot of money to get your urine tested for these mold mycotoxins. And when that inspector walks in that door, you show them the results. And the results may say Chaetomium globosum, or it may say Stachybotrys chartarum, whatever. It says what the mold mycotoxin is. And then you show that to the inspector and say, I need you to find this. Because it's in my body, I need you to find it. And like you said, Michael, if they're just doing a couple different air samples, and maybe, Dr. Lauren, you can ask Michael as far as, air sample testing and the pros and cons of that. But again, it's in my body, I need you to find it.
Yeah. So what are your thoughts on the ARMI and kind of the Swiffer testing?
Sure. Yeah. Obviously, a huge, hotly debated topic out there. There's pros and cons to every sampling. There's not one perfect sample solution. And unfortunately, if someone said, well, I want to select E, all of the above, and do them all, you start thinking, well, gosh, I'm going to have to pull out a second mortgage to be able to afford this type of sampling. This is a very common feeling. I remember Jack mentioning stress and anxiety. Well, there's those emotions that pop up. My personal background, my experience, perhaps you could say my bias, is I've collected thousands of what is known as an ERMI sample, these dust samples that are using qPCR analysis to look for not just big fat mold spores, but also the fragments. And there's arguably way more fragments in the environment. I'm published with the EPA. I have a study that we did comparing that to spore trap sampling. But again, there's always pros and cons. I think, and this conversation could go 8 levels deep, so I'll let you guide me, Lauren, on this one. But there's the DIY option to do dust samples. There's DIY options to do Petri dish sampling. I think at the end of the day, you just have to ask the question is, what value can I get out of this? If I am a homeowner and I read that I can go on a couple of websites and order this ERMI kit, and that they can range in cost typically between $250 and $300 face value for those samples, what am I really going to gain from that? Am I going to get a general picture? Because there are arguably times, right, Lauren, where maybe you're dealing with the patient and or their disgruntled spouse with their arms folded in the background, and they're not even willing to get the IEP out there. I find ironically that could be a good opportunity for one of those DIY type kits to raise awareness. But the truth of the matter is if you being the occupant, if you're listening to this, if you have the opportunity to get a qualified IEP involved in the beginning up front, please do it. I understand that might sound biased. Don't call me up. Use me as your reference if that's what it takes for you to believe me. That's fine. The takeaway is you need to get somebody who can quarterback this, because Lauren asked a great question, but the answer is it depends. Maybe an ERMI sample is appropriate right here to try and identify Chaetomium globosum because the mycotoxin was on the urine analysis results, and you're less likely to pick up evidence of that with a spore trap sample. But there's other times where the IEP might be looking for an active source, and qPCR analysis doesn't really give us an idea of viability or more recent activity. So there's a lot of pros and cons. I think that each test can be used to answer a variety of questions. I'm sorry I can't be more specific, and it's a case by case type thing.
Well, I think you bring up a good point, as well, is that to hire a professional. We're all about hiring a professional. If I have a roof leak, I don't try and fix it myself. I hire people that are professionals at that. And yes, once we diagnose you with these mold mycotoxins in your urine, then it's a matter of, okay, well, yeah, sure, you should due diligence, go look around your house for obvious sources of mold and water damage. But then number two, now you got to get an inspector in there. And Michael, is that the default where they would go to, ERMI or Swiffer? Or again, are most IEPs, or even speaking to you personally, what do you think your approach is? And especially when you see someone like me who's like, I've got these in my body, I need you to find them. What's your approach, and how do we find these?
I think a lot of people, certainly like you two, of course, but a lot of folks underestimate the value of a good visual inspection. So we're not even there with sampling yet. I don't need to sample. So part of the challenge with the type of testing that I'm talking about and you're talking about is that people need to understand that they really are surrogates too. There could be a lot of other organisms, oftentimes that are not being represented on these samples. So we're using these samples as surrogates to indicate exposure. And it's not like, let's say, use the example of Chaetomium earlier. and they have a mycotoxin that they produce. But it's not like the inspector's going to like ignore other mold that's not Chaetonium in the house, because there's holistic concerns that you naturally have that the occupant has. A good visual inspection to look for evidence of water staining, water damage, if they understand the building design, the low-hanging fruit. They have a HVAC system in Miami, Florida, brings a lot higher risk of concern than an HVAC system, right? In Tucson, Arizona. And that history, that client intake of tell me where there's been some leaks, you can do a lot and answer a lot of questions and potentially save that client money, because again, whether it's Petri dish sampling, spore trap sampling, wall cavity samples to try and locate actual sources, ERMI, and a variety of other more newer technologies coming out with bacteria now. I don't need to necessarily do that to find low-hanging fruit issues. I think what happens is we sit down with the client afterwards, we review what's obvious, what's low-hanging. We say, well, here's your options. You can either assume there's an issue here because there's a lot of outstanding evidence here. There was a sewage leak, the water went through the wall. That's an automatic remediation. I don't need a test to prove it. But then if they have other questions, like they would naturally sit down with them and say, Mike, I get it. It looks like there's a problem underneath my kitchen sink cabinet. But what I want to know also is, do I have cross-contamination in my house? I mean, it originated from the kitchen, fine, but do I have to clean all my surfaces, my contents? That's when you start bringing up some sampling oftentimes, because it's not easy. I can't see the contamination. So a lot of times we will sample. For me personally, a lot of times it ends up being ERMI or the qPCR. It's funny. We don't actually reference the score. I want everybody to know that officially. I don't look at the ERMI score. I'm looking at the individual molds and their quantities and using some other control data to answer that question. Does my house reflect normal fungal ecology, or is it contaminated? And then that's where sampling comes into play. Obviously, Jack, there's a variety of other reasons that would justify sampling. Maybe the doctor or you just need it as a baseline. Let's see what you're dealing with today. And then you can test on the back end if you have to remediate to verify that you've improved your environment. But holistically, I think the biggest success for me has actually not been in sampling. It's been in a very thorough visual assessment. Sampling just as ancillary data to help justify an action, such as, do I need to clean, or I do need to clean, and what level I need to take it to. And that brings me back to my earlier point, which is why you should probably get an IEP involved in the front end versus the back end. Because we have these nightmare stories of people spending thousands of dollars on DIY kits, and then you work with an IEP, they look at all that information, they go, yeah, but here's the problem, you didn't sample this right, or you sampled really old dust, or you sampled on actual mold when you're not supposed to. They get really frustrated and they go, what should I have done? And we're like, you should have reached out to the IEP first so they could have been your quarterback.
So we get the professional involved at the beginning.
Yes.
We get some, be it visual or some thorough, quantifying data of where and how much.
Yes.
But then, so what is your approach to remediation? So say it is localized to underneath the sink. Maybe it did end up down the hallway. So what does a kind of a timeline look like? So if somebody does have to remediate some walls in their home?
Sure. Working backwards, excellent question, and complicated, which is why we put a 4-part remediation series on IEP radio, by the way, because again, be an ambassador to know what best practices are. Timeline, fair question. Depends on what we're talking about. Just the remediation, just any amount of cleaning, you're usually in the wheelhouse of about a week. Plus or minus a couple of days, depending on a few factors, naturally. But really, the repairs is what we find are taking the long times. We'll normally tell somebody that a project from start to finish, meaning you're going to start remediation on day 1, and your house is going to be repaired on day X, is 4 to 6 weeks, assuming there's no other complications. In terms of the methodology, we follow to keep it simple. There are so many different things that I'm sure you guys have heard, been marketed with, of how to clean the house and fogging chemicals that we wonder, have they really been vetted? Can this potentially harm my patient, that sort of thing? But proper containment, proper engineering controls, these are vital. Elbow grease, as simple as that sounds, in the end has been, in my experience, the greatest success in a lot of my colleagues. And what I mean by that is you're going to have to HEPA vacuum those surfaces. You're going to have to damp wipe those surfaces. You're going to have to dry wipe those surfaces. It's repetition to remove. See, a lot of people think that a mold spore might look like this big old thing that you can easily pick up off the ground. We're talking about stuff that is extremely small. Let me nerd out with you for a second. On average, 250 mold spores can fit on the top of a needle pinhead, the kind you sew with side by side without falling out. For every one of those mold spores, depending on what study you read, there's anywhere between 300 and 500 fragments that are even smaller than those spores. So it's a numbers game, but we have found that you don't need a miracle fog. You don't need a miracle cleaning agent that is EPA registered, not EPA approved, that there's no such thing. And that is what's working to remediate the problem, contain the problem, all that, clean the house, and then test it on the back end to verify that your patient's home reflects normal fungal ecology.
Michael, you're talking about these fragments, and is fragment the same thing as a mycotoxin? Because I guess if you think about mold growing in a shower, and that mold in the shower releases these spores to propagate itself for its survival. And then those spores, in addition, they're releasing these mycotoxins. Are these the fragments you're referring to, or it can be fragment, but there's also other pieces and other proteins and materials that are released as well?
Yeah, beta glucans and cell wall material. Great question. So mycotoxins are a secondary metabolite. Translation, they can be created by mold that are known to produce those mycotoxins. Doesn't mean they'll always produce them. They are a chemical. So they might be free floating in an environment, or they might be attached to a mold spore, a mold fragment. To answer your question, picture a mold fragment as anything. It could be that mold spore busted into 1,000 pieces. It can be the conidiaphore, the roots, if for those listening, of the mold that are fragmented. It's the structure of the mold, and it's not always a clean. And mold's organic, like we are. We all break down, and so it fragments. So holistically, just a quick aside, but to the question, we're not just focusing on mycotoxin removal. We're trying to remove the whole part of it, because the truth of the matter is while we might use mycotoxins in clinical practice as a surrogate to try and address an issue, a lot of folks are dealing with inflammatory responses to other parts of the mold that aren't just a mycotoxin. And I tread lightly because I'm not a doctor, so you guys can clarify these points if needed. But even if it was, it's not like we can say, okay, leave the mold spore here in the house and remove the mycotoxin. So the techniques that are supported in our industry are complete removal.
Wow. I mean, amazing stuff. And I think, once again, that, and this is the Healthy Heart Show. We're talking with our guest, Michael Schrantz, myself, Dr. Lauren Lattanza. And again, all cardiovascular issues, we can make the case, again, that mold and water damage building, mold mycotoxins, mold spores, mold fragments, we're learning, all these things are, again, causing cardiovascular disease. So you can go to see another physician and they can put you on pharmaceuticals to cover up symptoms, or we can address the cause. And this is a major cause, we feel, 21st century crisis as to what's going on. But Michael, you made the point earlier that we're testing, now you find the source of where the mold is, for example, and say it's under the kitchen sink. But now these mold spores and fragments and mycotoxins, they have been aerosolized. And now theoretically, they could be everywhere in your house, And you mentioned before about testing different surfaces, for contamination. You could obviously test individual surfaces, or you can say, okay, my house is contaminated and I got to wipe down, I got to HEPA-vac, I got to as many surfaces as I can touch to improve on. But then also there's other things. What if can you clear a piece of cotton clothing or cotton, based furniture, wool-based furniture? Really dives into so many different issues. And I'm sure you've got a million stories you could talk about where people have had to get rid of everything, just kind of like walk out their front door with a fresh pair of, pajamas waiting for them and start over.
The Healthy Heart Show will be right back after we take this quick break to hear from our sponsor. Would you like to drink great tasting coffee that's also good for your heart health? Cardiology Coffee is your answer. This 5-star rated coffee is delicious. It's a gourmet coffee that begins with whole organic beans, hand-selected and carefully roasted. It's tested and certified to be free of pesticides, mold, and other toxins. Cardiology Coffee is great for your heart, and you're going to love how it tastes. Order now online at cardiologycoffee.com. Now back to the Healthy Heart Show.
Yeah, it's if I'm hearing it, and it's a great point. You mentioned a lot of them, but I think what I heard from you is the question of what about those contents? Contents, porous items are another very hot topic. I do have an opinion, a strong one about that one, although it's not black and white. Here's what we can tell you. Let's talk about the science first of all. When you hear people throwing things away, and you don't understand the backstory, or a lot of times when you do get into the stories, you'll find out it was really fear-based. And unfortunately, there's a lot of celebrity or authoritative type figures that are either insinuate that you should do that or flat out state it. But when you ask them for the data, the actual third-party studies, that sort of thing, you'll find that there's like elephant in the room. It's quiet and all that. I interviewed, and again, a shameless plug for a free resource on IEP Radio, episode 19, Dr. Ralph Moon. We did he did a study back in 2005 where they inoculated different types of fabrics that were synthetic or natural with mold. In fact, Stachybotrys shitarum and Aspergillus versicolor and the associated mycotoxins that they produced. They did all this testing, scanning electronic microscopy and all other sorts of things to really get an idea of the question is could we wash these? At the time, dry cleaning was felt, well, just take your item like your t-shirt or those linens and just send them to the dry cleaner. And the study revealed that actually normal laundering, I'm talking your normal laundry detergent or notice I said or with bleach, where appropriate, were the most effective, hear me out on this, at removing a vast majority of the contaminants. That would be the fungal structures, the spores, the fragments, and the mycotoxins. But here's something else that we also learned, and probably more important. There's a big difference between mold growing on an item. I'm going to get visual here. Here's the roots, getting into the material, very difficult to remove. Kind of makes sense. Versus it settling on. And what I'm trying to tell you and suggest is that for those of you listening, you shouldn't automatically assume that you have to throw everything away. And yes, there's exceptions, and I'm going to try and give you a few of these. But normal cleaning of most items has been shown through testing and data to be fairly effective at removal. However, because we know it's not an exact science, 14 spores is good, but 15 spores on your item your arm's gonna fall off. No one has that, right? We would normally tell people to, clean them, but then store them in plastic sealed containers, like plastic bins with the rubber gaskets on the lid. Not because we want you to ignore them, but oftentimes that's what gets people to freeze and do nothing. They get so overwhelmed with the prospect of what they might have to do with everything that they don't do any of it. Your main concern is your home. This is your sanctuary. It's what it's supposed to be. This is what your concern is. And to address that, but let me just put some perspective on this. So short takeaways. If there's not mold growing on it, it is not an automatic you have to throw it away. And even if there was mold growing on it, it's a case-by-case situation. We would never tell you to throw away your photo album or that crochet that your great grandma made for you. We might not have you sleeping with it, but it's not, you don't have to feel like you have to throw everything away. And I want to argue this. Yes, there's exceptions. And no, I don't mean to make this a blanket statement for every single item. It is a case-by-case situation. We've seen straight up situations where, it was just better to get rid of it. And usually there was a good reason. But consider this. You'll love this. It's interesting how we're prejudiced. Allow me to explain. If a mold species from outside lands on your t-shirt like it is right now, you're fine. You're not going to get upset. You're not going to burn your shirt. You're going to launder it like you normally do. And you'll probably end up wearing that same shirt in another week or two, like most people. The second that same mold species, same one, grows inside the home, there's this feeling that the community treats it like it's plutonium. All of a sudden, it's an issue. We have a problem with it. So what I'm trying to provide to the audience is perspective. We have so many people that are fear-mongering, using fear-based. I mean, sometimes it's easier for people to press the reset button. I get it. And some people are blessed to be able to do that. But what it has caused is a culture of fear and thinking that we need to live in glass bubbles on Mars, which is not the world we live in. And no one's really defending the other piece of it. Like, you realize that the same species that landed on your t-shirt, and I didn't say growing, is the same thing that, it could have grown in the house as outside. And so the conclusion is a compromise. We know that it can't be 0 on your shirt, meaning no mold, no mycotoxins, but it certainly doesn't, and it can't be 0 because there's no such thing as that, but you don't have to automatically assume removal. What's the solution? Well, the DIY pieces is go through the items and see if there's any evidence of actual growth on it. And you likely would want to address those items. If you can discard them, great. End of story. Now we don't have to worry about it. If it's an item of intrinsic value, take it away, put it in a plastic seal container, get it out of your living space. But you likely will involve an IEP somewhere in this process so they can help you inventory each item, because we don't want you to shoot yourself in the foot. If you're going to go through all this remediation and cleaning, and then you remove, like, say, for example, Dr. Lauren's got these books behind her right now, and they're all moldy. We're not saying, take those books out and then bring them back in and cross-contaminate your home. What we're saying is that it can be overwhelming. It's not an automatic throw it away. Ask the question, do you see growth on it? Does it smell funny, musty? Do you feel weird when you put that item on? Use those as clues to discard them. Otherwise, consider trying to clean them and following industry standard to do that.
All good tips. Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. So, and on our clinical side, we see obviously the sort of vague symptoms that can range greatly, from headaches to chronic allergies or cardiac issues, atrial fibrillation, high blood pressure. And maybe you don't often get that clinical piece, but what are some of the most common symptom pictures that you do hear from indoor air pollution?
Yeah, you named a lot of them, and I think to name a few: headache, a weakness, a foggy brain, joint pains, cramps, confusion, coughing, excessive thirst. I mean, the list goes on. Those are common. The problem we have, and to your point about it takes a village, is if you go online and look these things up, it can include anything from just being stressed out from work to having cancer, and that's overwhelming. So a lot of times, to add a point, we actually rely on the clinicians to provide that cluster symptom analysis and say, well, this does seem to be differential and specific to mold. Maybe that's in combination or concert with a urine analysis or cytokine testing or whatever you're using to track this patient. And that helps us, because at the end of the day, I think the other issue is we have IEPs that are out there that are giving clinical advice that they shouldn't do. Guys, this is a complicated illness. This is a complicated exposure. Just like we don't want our patients to think that DIY sampling is going to answer all their questions. It's the same thing on the clinical side, where they rely on your expertise to say, well, this is why this is unique and this is different. But you're right, it's all over the point. I've seen people that say, I got ice pick pain in my hands, and I've seen other people who are high functioning where they don't have any symptoms. It's just that their doctors saying, you seem to have a upregulation or downregulation of these inflammatory markers, and we're trying to figure out why.
Yeah, I think also, is that, and I tell people, they say, oh, I don't have a mold issue. I don't have any problems with mold. I don't have any symptoms. I say, yeah, but you've got high blood pressure, or you've been labeled, with coronary artery disease on a CT scan, or you've got atrial fibrillation, maybe mold mycotoxicity, maybe poor indoor air quality from water damaged buildings is a factor. And now you need to mitigate that, not because of symptoms, but because you have obvious clinical disease that may be related to this particular issue. So that's why we need to take the next step. And as we find an IEP expert, I think, Michael, you can tell this better than I, that there's a whole range maybe of these people, not only in quality, but also in maybe even the understanding of people's clinical symptoms and how it relates. Some people may be like, hey, I became an IEP, an indoor environmental, professional, because I suffered with this personally, or maybe my spouse did, or a child did, or a parent did. And I understand the full gravity of what the possibilities are as it pertains to health. And other people would maybe that are IEPs don't really get that clinical side. But this is an opportunity to say, well, your physician is really in charge of the clinical side. And we're going to the IEP to say, hey, find the problems in my dwelling.
Right. Exactly. Paradigm change, the shift is what I picked up from those points. And it's true. The old model, the traditional model of inspection, we didn't really dive that deep into it. Not that it was our role to be, again, clinicians and offer medical advice, but there were a lot of assumptions possibly made, and we were still learning. I mean, we didn't say things like inflammatory response, and we weren't even really necessarily talking about fragments decades ago. We were looking at more acute issues, absentee at work, and why is this happening? Is it because there's too much toner coming out of the copy machine, or is it because that there was a mold issue in the bathroom or whatever? So you're right. I think the problem is that a lot of us have glossy websites, and we say all the right things to make the client feel good, but the real question is are we calibrated to meet these new challenges of exposures that, I'm guessing that it wasn't but a few decades ago where you used to have a symptom and dad told you, quit your bitching, just take a Tylenol. And then we've learned that no, there was some underlying things in here. Well, if the IEP has the same challenges, we're trying to figure out, well, you know what, maybe this type of sample analysis, of spore trap sampling as an example. And I don't mean to pick on spore trap sampling. I've done thousands of them, but they don't detect the fragments. And so that you could miss it. That doesn't mean there's not a exposure problem in the house. The other issue is I've seen IEPs flat out just dismiss things. There's mold in the evaporator coil in their air conditioning system. I see that all the time though. That's no big deal. It's like, where did that come from? And it's just this whole thing about that's the old model. So that's why, to your point, the challenge is real, and why those couple of resources that I know are going to be available for you folks afterwards are starting points for you. But ultimately, you need to educate yourself, and even that ICI, International Society for Environmentally Acquired Illness, on the Good Help page, there's actually a 1 or 2 page document finding an IEP that was written by myself and a few others to kind of guide folks to say, well, what am I looking for? Because it's not a special flashlight. People go, what do you do different, Mike? Why do you know all this stuff? Is it a special tool you have that nobody else has? No, it's not. It's critical thinking. It's listening to what the doctors are saying and saying, okay, well, how can we apply this? If we're missing it, are we missing it because we don't have the right tools for the job? Those resources can help you find the right person.
Awesome. So we've kind of talked about identifying in your current home, but say somebody is moving for whatever reason. Maybe it is that they had to walk right out their front door and have a new set of pajamas waiting for them somewhere else. But what tips would you give and suggestions for people looking for a new home, or, building a home, shopping for a home? What might you look for in that process? Yeah,
a lot of similarities, right? You think about, is there any evidence of water staining or water damage or mold growth? Are you looking at all of the plumbing sources underneath kitchen sinks and vanities? And if it has an air conditioning system, of course, with the AC, the cooling part, are you having that visually inspected? Does it have a crawl space? Does the house smell musty? How do you feel if you're very symptomatic? And assuming you can trust your symptoms, because that's a whole other issue. Low hanging fruit things. How's the landscaping? Is it at the bottom of the hill where the water just collects all around the house and under the house, or does it appear to have good drainage? But none of these things, truth be told, Lauren, are deal breakers. What's a deal breaker is relative to the individual. I mean, you can fix a house if you spend enough money. I would say that, if you're dealing with a crawl space, for example, that's typically an expensive fix. You're anywhere from $8,000 to $30,000, depending on the complexity. So that's a real number. Even a kitchen sink cabinet, if there's mold damage in there, let's say they have granite countertops. Next thing you know, you're remediating that, and then they break the granite. Now you have to replace it. Now you're spending $10,000, $15,000 that you didn't intend to. But that's relative, right? The one individual looks like that and says, oh man, that's a deal breaker. The other one says, well, that's unfortunate, but this house is worth it. I don't want to do it, but I am. Because of those complications, and again, one more shameless plug, is why we created episodes 9 and episode 25 on IEP Radio. IEP Radio episode 25 talks about things to consider when buying a home. And what you will find on that is strategy. That's what folks are really wanting, is how can I, let's say, working with a realtor. I actually interview my wife, who's a realtor, on that podcast, and we talk about, the issue is timing. It's finding a realtor who can be your advocate to screen in and rule out. I mean, if you walk into a house and it smells musty and there's problems everywhere, but you've got 3 other choices that are much better, might be safe to reasonably rule out that one because it's complicated. It also gives you strategy about like, should I do a DIY? Should I do an ERMI sample? Some people talk about that. Should I do my own sample? And the answer is, yeah, if you have the budget, you can, but user beware. Does that dust represent that house? Or does it represent the cleaning service that came out to get the house ready for showing and that vacuum cleaner that was used in 50 other moldy homes? Didn't think about that. So there's a lot of things to consider. And because it's complicated, just, look for those low hanging fruits that we talk about in episode 9 and 25, because at the end of the day, you may find that this house is the house of your dreams, or let's be realistic. Right now, it's a seller's market for many people and you don't have a lot of options. So you have to look at it differently and say, you know what, I'm willing to deal with this. I don't want to, but don't assume because you have mold in a vanity in your bathroom that you have to walk, but be aware and conscious that you probably should address it.
No, that's great stuff. Yeah, and I would also say that, there is kind of like this general inspection that happens after you sign a contract to purchase a home. And that general inspection will come in and say, okay, well, I took a look at the HVAC system to make sure it's functioning. And I took a look at the lighting, and I took a look again at the appliances. But then I think, Michael, you'd agree that there is this opportunity for a separate indoor environmental professional to come in and look at some of these other things. For example, I know you
without
also
a doubt. Yeah.
Have knowledge on radon, right? So it's, whether it's, radon exposure, looking for obvious sources of mold, really kind of, if you're going to invest all this money on a house, make sure you have all the facts before you close on it. And those facts, I think it's obviously extremely important to know about that indoor air quality before you get out of that inspection period.
We talk about, great point on episode 25, but I'm glad you brought it up. One of the strategies is just that day one of the inspection, if you can plan it, is the general home inspector, and they're going to look for low hanging fruit. I wouldn't trust them, ironically, to look for mold problems, but you never know. They might find, this house doesn't have a roof, and you're going to walk just because. There's other deal breakers, so you screen it. A lot of times, though, when we're working with people who have a chronic illness or a low dose environmental exposure concern, you're right. We talk about you're gonna have to spend more money. Get an IEP out there on the same day, or if you can do it day 2. That way, if you need to cancel because you found something on day 1 with the general inspector, if you have an air conditioning system, don't just have them inspect the system for functionality, which you need to do that as well. But check it. Have them photograph the evaporator coil. Treat it like a glamour shoot. Because at the end of the day, what the reality of it is that when I look at evaporator coil, I'm going to be looking at it differently than an HVAC technician. And the photos are helpful because then you can either take it back to the IEP you're working with, or maybe you're working virtually. There's a few of us IEPs that offer virtual services, and we can look at it and go, no, that's actually an issue. You can actually see growth along the ductwork, and that's going to insinuate you're going to need to replace that ductwork. And so now you need to get an estimate of what that's going to cost, because you're trying to figure out if you want to buy this home or not. So absolutely well said. If you're in that category of illness or exposure, if I were you, I would make the IEP inspection piece mandatory, just like you'd want a normal home inspection.
Spending, a couple $1,000s, if that's what it amounts to, up front to potentially save you 50, 100, 200K down the road. Not to mention your contamination of your belongings and stuff like that. It can get ugly very quickly. Invest in the IEP upfront, no doubt.
Yeah, I love that you talk about using the strategy, using the time, the team, everything at your disposal, using it wisely with a strategy going into all of that.
Right. So you're not feeling overwhelmed. So absolutely.
So what are some common misconceptions that you see in this field that you'd like to address, or maybe just kind of some blanket things that you'd like our listeners to know about indoor air quality? Maybe they're not as familiar as, you and I, and it's new to them. So what would you like to address?
Yeah, thank you for this opportunity. There's a couple of things just to contrast each other. There's no doubt, for the record, that we have concerns about environmental exposures. And I think the challenge with chronic illness is that they're not normally an acute exposure, like 20, 30 square feet of mold growth growing on a wall. You walk into the house, it hits you in the face, you pass out. But these are more like your leg breaking. These are acute things. And so it's frustrating. Sometimes people are like, is that really what's going on? But there's a ton of evidence about water damage building. We even have governmental organizations and other things, the EPA, that recognize that. And there's a consensus that it's a concern. I say that up front because the other thing too is in my personal experience, what I've seen kind of come out of the woodwork in the last few years is the other extreme. And so I just want to provide some perspective here in a minute or two. And that is the term one, normal fungal ecology. Folks, our goal is not mold free. Yet some of you have heard that term, and some of us use that term to mean different things. But what your goal should be ultimately in your house is that normal fungal ecology would be normal background levels of the molds that are outside of your house. We live in a world surrounded by this, and without it, we wouldn't be here. I said that earlier. And that's your goal. You may or may not, that may or may not be enough of a concentration to make a difference for you. You may be super sensitive, but for a vast majority of people who need to detox or get treatment or whatnot, if you can get the house to reflect normal fungal ecology, that is your target. And I want you to know that and hear that, because believe it or not, there's a lot of people that think if you find a mold spore in your house, that's a problem. And it clearly shows that they don't have an understanding, probably no thanks to a lot of the bad information they can find online. The other thing too is I think we need to have better definitions of the term exposure and things like contamination. I personally hate the word contamination because it reminds me of like radiation or plutonium. But I think we use it because we want to describe an exposure to something that we would want you to be exposed to, hence the term contamination. But just remember that normal fungal ecology, it's not like it's a tight ship. It's a moving target. Like right now, even as we're talking, the levels, the concentrations of the types of mold that are in the air settling out are changing. Not drastically, but they're not static. They're not just hovering and not moving. And so it is a moving target, and it's not that simple. And maybe that offers some relief to people on the other perspective of saying is that we're not looking for an exact level, and that I can tolerate ranges. I don't have to have zero mold free. And the other term, of course, is exposure. Folks, we don't live in a clean room. We don't live in a bubble on Mars. I say that for this reason. We have immune systems, and our bodies depend on exposures to keep us strong in background levels. I have even found that some people think when they use the term exposure that they have to have nothing in their house. Folks, we are constantly exposed to various concentrations of dirt, dust, pollens, plants, fibers, molds, bacteria that are normal background. And you could argue that's an exposure. So I think we just need to do a better job as IEPs, as professionals, to speak wisely to our audience and say, we're looking for normal fungal ecology. You will have exposure that's normal exposure, but it's when it becomes elevated or atypical that folks like Lauren and Jack become concerned, and they start seeing evidence of that either in the cluster symptom analysis that they're looking at with you, or maybe perhaps it's a urine analysis or whatever biomarker they're using to follow you, and that's when it becomes a concern. So I just want to touch on that because it actually is a touchy subject for a lot of people.
Yeah, and I think to continue with that theme as well is that I like to have people remember the common sense. And the common sense of, what are the best foods, the importance of sleep, the importance of sunshine, the common sense things that the medical doctors have typically lost. And common sense would tell us that we have been exposed and been around bacteria and viruses and molds and parasites. And we have evolved in all of that. And as you said, we should embrace all of those things as it helps prime our immune system and make us as healthy as we can be. But the problem would lie in, of course, is that years ago, we had open buildings, open housing structures that were allowed to breathe, that a lot of outdoor air was coming into exchange with the indoor air and vice versa. But now, under the guise of eco-friendly and keeping energy costs down and the green movement, we live in so many of these hermetically sealed buildings with materials that could easily foster growth from water damage. And yes, recognizing that this kind of 21st century environment could be leading to any symptom you have or any sign or disease or medical condition you may be suffering from.
Spot on. In fact, the energy crisis you referred to, late 60s, early 70s, let's build these houses and buildings tighter. Let's save on our utility bills. Everybody raises their hand and likes that. That's exciting. But it was an inverse relationship holistically with indoor air quality. And we started seeing new phrases emerge: sick building syndrome, building related illness, and really trying to figure out, well, what is going on? Because again, it wasn't acute, it was subtle. It kind of came in through the back door, so to speak. And in these tighter buildings, we realized that maybe we had exposures before, but there were some wiggle room, some flex in the fact that they were leakier and the outdoor environment was diluting the concentrations enough to where they weren't ultimately they weren't presenting themselves symptomatically in the people. So yeah, it's absolutely important when we think about the home and exposure. Half of it, to your point, is certainly finding the sources and removing it like a cancer. The other part is creating just a healthier home. And we start having to incorporate new techniques that the older homes weren't doing. Natural ventilation was just opening up a back door, front door, and letting a little draft in. And I still recommend, I think it's a great idea when weather permits, but now we're using terms like mechanical ventilation and bringing in fresh air and using better filters that we have in our homes today to, I guess you might say, compensate for how we've changed that built environment of today.
Great stuff. Great stuff. Today, our guest on the Healthy Heart Show was Dr. Michael Schrantz. Michael Schrantz, who is the house doctor. And Michael, give us a little, you told us some fantastic places to get more information. You talked about IEP radio. No shameless plugs there, because this is all great information that our listeners need to go find. So give us a refresher one more time. Where can people find out more about you and how they can work with you?
Sure. I always start by telling IEPradio.com because it's a free resource. It's totally education. A lot of folks, when they see these things, they're like, you're real big on show me the data. So I actually have a references page that lists where I'm pulling a lot of this information from, because a lot of us are lost. But if you're looking for something more personal, if you're looking for me to consult with you, that's great. I appreciate the opportunity. You can go to environmentalanalytics.net. Environmental Analytics, the name of the company. One big long word, .net. And you can learn more about me. My CV's up there to kind of get a little bit better idea of my background. And there's a contact form you can fill out, and I'll do what we can to help.
Sounds good. And, you mentioned kind of those shorter URLs as well, acac.org, iseai.org. You chose a long name, environmentalanalytics.net. We have naturalheartdoctor.com. So we've got some longer URLs, but we'll make it easy. We'll put all these into the show notes. And really, really fantastic. And Dr. Lauren, I'll let you close it down. But again, we appreciate you being on the show, Michael.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time and all the valuable information. But before we let you go, I just wanted to bring it back to cardiovascular wellness and ask you specifically, how do you live a heart healthy life?
Yeah, sure. Very, very fair. It's funny. I've had some personal changes in my own life. The end of last year, I was looking at how overweight I was, and I hide it well. But diet, eating healthy is huge. I have found that little thing called portion control and eating more organic foods. I'm shopping at the Sprouts and the Whole Foods and things as much as I can. Was a major game player in my gut biome and being able to, just feel better. You might imagine that I'm also have a home with upgraded filtration and mechanical ventilation, practice what you preach. And I'm hopeful that doing that has made an improvement to myself and my family. But the other thing too, quite honestly, is stress management. I think we are so distracted with today's demands and technologies, our phones, our computers, that we've taken for granted with that downtime. We used to make fun of people that lived a slow life. Now I envy them. And so I would just argue that stress management has been huge in my own life. And I got to tell you, night and day different between diet and stress management has been, it was like I woke up in a new skin, a new body. And that's what I've been doing mainly.
I love it. Got to bring it back to basics. Good food, clean air, and stress management.
Amen.
Well, thank you.
And no talk about pharmaceuticals, which is fantastic.
Usually not. Well, we appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Jack, Lauren, thank you.
That does it for today's episode. Thanks so much for listening to the Healthy Heart Show. Please help us get the word out by liking and subscribing to our podcast and our Facebook page, Natural Heart Doctor. Please show support for our podcast sponsor, Cardiology Coffee, your resource for organic, antioxidant-rich, mold and pesticide-free coffee shipped straight to your door. Learn more by adding @cardiologycoffee on Instagram and visiting cardiologycoffee.com. This podcast provides materials for information and educational purposes only and should not be considered medical advice. We encourage you to contact your physician for any of the health issues discussed here.